My name is Scarlett. I'm 34 years old, and on paper, my life looks steady. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work as a financial compliance analyst for a mid-sized healthcare firm. I own a modest townhouse with too many plants and not enough sunlight. I pay my bills on time. I call my parents on Sundays. Most people describe me the same way: calm, responsible, easy. The kind of woman who doesn't cause problems. The kind who listens more than she speaks. At work, I'm the one colleagues trust with delicate audits and uncomfortable truths. In my family, I've always been the dependable daughter, the one who didn't rebel, didn't explode, didn't demand. But dependable and invisible can look very similar from the outside. If you met me casually, you might assume I've never struggled. I don't wear my history loudly. I don't cry in public. I don't post dramatic quotes online. I learned early how to fold my emotions neatly, like winter sweaters, and store them where no one could trip over them. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone, and it certainly isn't about humiliating my parents. It's about a conversation I waited almost 2 decades to have. For years, I carried something heavy that no one could see, not because it was dramatic, not because it made headlines, but because it was quiet. It was made up of small dismissals, subtle corrections, jokes that didn't feel like jokes, expectations that were never discussed, but always enforced. I grew up believing that love meant endurance, that gratitude meant silence, that being the good daughter required shrinking just enough to keep everyone comfortable. And I did shrink, gradually, efficiently. So well, in fact, that even I didn't notice at first. Until one day, I did. This video is about what happens when you finally realize that the wounds you minimized were real. When you understand that staying silent may have preserved peace, but at the cost of yourself. It's about the moment I decided to say the words. I confronted my parents about the pain I endured in the past, not with anger, not with accusations, but with clarity. And it's about what changed afterward, in them, and more importantly, in me. If you've ever been the quiet one in your family, if you've ever questioned whether your hurt was big enough to speak about, if you've ever wondered what would happen if you finally said it out loud, I want you to stay with me, because sometimes the strongest thing a quiet person can do is speak, not to win, but to be whole. Have you ever carried something for so long that you almost forgot it was heavy? Character generation. Full name: Scarlett Elaine Whitmore. Age: 34. City and country: Portland, Oregon, United States. Surface: role: financial compliance analyst in a healthcare corporation. Hidden strength / leverage: exceptional pattern recognition, meticulous documentation habits, and deep emotional self-regulation developed through years of silent observation. Personality traits: observant, measured, disciplined, empathetic but boundaried, slow to anger, precise with words, emotional wound, chronic emotional minimization, growing up feeling that her feelings were too sensitive, overreactions, or inconvenient moral code, truth without cruelty, accountability without humiliation. Love does not require self-erasure. Signature: object: a slim, leather-bound journal she has kept since age 16. Character image prompt: no explanation. Cinematic, ultra-realistic portrait of Scarlett Elaine Whitmore, 34 years old, natural Caucasian ethnicity, calm, intelligent eyes, subtle emotional depth, modern realistic style, soft dramatic lighting, shallow depth of field, 35mm photography look, wearing a tailored charcoal blazer over a soft cream blouse, background subtly hinting a minimalist home office with plants and warm lamplight, mood, quiet dominance, high detail, YouTube thumbnail ready, 16 to 9. If you asked my parents to describe me growing up, they would have smiled. Scarlet, oh, she was the easy one. That word followed me like a soft shadow. Easy. I didn't argue much. I did well in school. I cleaned my room without being asked twice. When relatives came over, I helped set the table. When my younger cousin cried, I was the one who knelt down to distract her. My older brother Daniel was strong-willed. That's what they called him when he slammed doors or challenged curfews. He was passionate, independent, a future leader. I was thoughtful. It sounds like a compliment. And maybe it was meant to be. But in our house, thoughtfulness often meant silence. When Daniel raised his voice, the house adjusted around him. When I went quiet, no one noticed. Silence from me was expected. It was my default setting. I don't remember a single dramatic incident from childhood. No explosive fights, no cruel punishments. What I remember instead are small, almost invisible moments, like when I tried to explain why a teacher's comment hurt me, and my mother said gently, "Scarlett, you're just sensitive. Don't take everything so personally." Or when I wanted to audition for the skull play, and my father said, "That's not really your thing. You're more of a behind-the-scenes girl." It was never shouted, never harsh, just redirected. And I learned quickly. If I were upset, I would evaluate first. Is this reasonable? Is this dramatic? Is this worth disturbing the atmosphere? Most of the time, the answer was no, so I adjusted. At family gatherings, Daniel told loud stories, and everyone laughed. I refilled drinks. When relatives asked about my future, my parents would answer for me. "She's very practical. She'll do something stable. She doesn't need attention." And I would smile, because arguing would make it awkward. In high school, I became extremely competent. Not brilliant in a showy way, just reliable. Teachers trusted me with group projects. Friends confided in me. Guidance counselors described me as mature for my age. What they didn't see was how often I rehearsed conversations in my head before speaking, how carefully I edited my emotions to make sure they were palatable. At home, my parents praised me for not being difficult. They said they were lucky to have one child who didn't cause stress. I wore that like a badge of honor. Being the low-maintenance daughter meant I was good. It meant I was loved. It meant I wasn't a burden. What I didn't understand then was that love shouldn't require disappearing. When Daniel struggled in college, my parents rallied around him. They financed extra tutoring, drove hours to attend his events, and defended his choices to skeptical relatives. When I graduated at the top of my class and secured a scholarship, my father hugged me and said, "See, we never had to worry about you." He meant it as praise, but something in me tightened. Never had to worry about you, because I never showed you anything that might worry you, because I handled it alone. I wasn't neglected. I wasn't unloved. I was assumed to be fine, assumed to be strong, assumed not needed. And when a child is consistently assumed not need, she learns to convince herself that she doesn't. That was who I was to them. The stable one, the reasonable one, the daughter who would understand. And for a long time, I did. The first cut wasn't loud. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It didn't even look like a wound at the time. I was 14. Middle school had just ended, and I had spent weeks preparing for a regional academic competition. It wasn't glamorous. No stage lights, no cheering crowds, just rows of folding tables, sharpened pencils, and the quiet tension of teenagers who took things too seriously. I won second place, not first, but second out of nearly 200 students across the district. When they called my name, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not pride exactly, but expansion. Like maybe I was allowed to take up a little more space than usual. I remember rehearsing how I would tell my parents in the car. I imagined my mother's smile, my father's approving nod, maybe even a celebratory dinner suggestion. Instead, when I held up the certificate at the kitchen counter, my father glanced at it briefly and said, "Second, that's still good?" "Still good," my mother added gently. "You always do well in these things. We're proud of you." But she was stirring soup while she said it. Daniel was at the table complaining about soccer practice. The television was on low volume in the background. Nothing paused. Nothing shifted. The house absorbed my achievement like it absorbed everything else I offered, efficiently, quietly, without disruption. That night, I placed the certificate inside a folder in my desk drawer. Not on the refrigerator, not framed, just stored. I told myself it didn't matter. They had said they were proud. What more did I need? But something small and sharp settled inside me, a question I didn't know how to articulate yet. Would it have been different if Daniel had won something? A week later, he scored the winning goal in a local game. My parents drove to 3 different relatives' houses with photos on their phones. My father retold the moment like it was a championship event. I clapped along. I smiled. I meant it. But my body registered the contrast. That was the first time I understood something without language for it. Excitement in our house was reserved for certain kinds of victories. Loud ones, public ones, competitive ones. Mine were quiet, academic, internal. They didn't disturb the rhythm of the family. Over time, I began pre-softening my accomplishments before presenting them. It's not a big deal, but I just got lucky. It's nothing compared to. I made sure no one felt overshadowed. I made sure I didn't sound like I needed celebration. And because I downplayed it, they did too. It became a loop. Years later, my mother would say, "You've always been so independent. You never needed validation." She believed that. I helped her believe it. That competition certificate stayed in a drawer for years. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because I had already internalized the message. My wins were expected. My effort was baseline. My excellence was convenient. The cut wasn't that they didn't love me. It was that my inner world didn't alter theirs. And when you're 14, that realization doesn't break you dramatically. It just teaches you to adjust. So I did. I stopped waiting for pauses. I stopped anticipating celebration. I learned to clap for myself, quietly. And the house remained peaceful, but something had shifted. I began noticing, after that first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. There was no turning point, no confrontation, no tearful night where I swore things would change. Instead, something subtler happened. I adapted. By 16, I had become highly skilled at emotional translation. I could take a dismissive comment and reinterpret it as practicality. I could take the comparison and label it motivation. I could take an absence and rename it trust. It sounds generous. It was survival. One evening during my junior year of high school, I was accepted into an advanced summer writing program in Seattle. It was competitive and required a portfolio submission. I hadn't told many people I applied. It felt fragile, like a wish you whisper into your hands before blowing it into the air. When the acceptance email arrived, I stared at the screen for a long time before telling my parents. At dinner, I said carefully, "I got into that writing program I mentioned." My father looked up. "How long is it?" "6 weeks." "In Seattle?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "That's far and expensive. I have a partial scholarship. I could get a part-time job to cover the rest." My mother sighed. "Scarlett, you already have so much on your plate. AP classes, college applications. Is writing really practical?" There it was again. Practical. Daniel had switched extracurriculars 3 times that year alone. Each shift was framed as an exploration, growth, finding himself. Mine was evaluated for return on investment. I felt the familiar internal recalibration begin. "They're not dismissing you," I told myself. "They're protecting you. They just don't want you overwhelmed. They're thinking about your future." I nodded. "You're right, it's probably too much." The program director later emailed asking if I was still interested. I declined. And then I explained it to my friends as if it had been my idea all along. It wasn't really aligned with my goals. I said it so smoothly I almost believed it. This became a pattern. Whenever I expressed something that didn't fit the quiet, reliable daughter mold, it was gently steered back into alignment. When I considered studying literature instead of finance, my father said, "You're too smart to choose something unstable." When I cried after a breakup in college, my mother said, "You've always been strong. Don't let a boy derail you." When I once admitted I felt overshadowed by Daniel, there was a brief silence before my father replied, "We've always treated you equally. If you feel that way, it's in your head. Not angry, not cruel, just final." So I began to distrust my own perceptions. If I felt overlooked, I was being dramatic. If I felt hurt, I was too sensitive. If I felt unseen, I was ungrateful. I became the family mediator, the one who smoothed arguments between my parents and Daniel, the one who reminded everyone of birthdays, the one who remembered details. I was valued, but functionally, reliable, level-headed, low maintenance. There's a kind of disrespect that doesn't shout. It simply assumes you'll adjust. And because I kept adjusting, no one had to confront the imbalance. Looking back now, I don't believe my parents intended harm. They loved me in the language they understood. They rewarded resilience because they thought it meant strength. What they didn't realize was that resilience without recognition becomes erasure. And I didn't realize that each time I rationalized a dismissal, I was teaching them how to treat me. By the time I graduated from college with a degree in finance, practical, stable, impressive, I had fully internalized the role. I was the one who would understand, the one who wouldn't make things difficult, the one who didn't need applause. It didn't feel like disrespect anymore. It felt normal, and that was the most dangerous part. It took me years to realize I had been cast in a role I never consciously auditioned for. In every family, there are unspoken positions: the hero, the rebel, the peacemaker, the fragile one, the golden child, the problem child. I was the stabilizer, the emotional ballast. If my brother were the storm, I was the anchor. If he was potential, I was proof. Proof that my parents had done something right. Proof that discipline worked. Proof that not all children were unpredictable. At family gatherings, the pattern became almost rehearsed. Daniel would arrive late, animated, carrying stories that required oxygen. My parents leaned toward him, ready to respond. I arrived on time. I helped in the kitchen. I noticed when my aunt looked tired and refilled her tea without being asked. If a political debate started, I diffused it. If someone felt slighted, I smoothed it. I became indispensable in invisible ways. My parents often said, "We don't know what we'd do without you." It sounded affectionate, but I began to hear the subtext. You keep things running, not we see you. When I started working full-time after college, the dynamic didn't change. It matured. Daniel struggled through a few career pivots. My parents offered advice, financial cushioning, and patience. His uncertainty was framed as bravery. When I received my first promotion at 26, my father said, "That's great. I always knew you'd be fine." Fine. That word followed me like easy once had. Fine meant predictable. Fine meant no risk. Fine meant self-sufficient. And self-sufficient people don't get fussed over. They don't require extra emotional bandwidth. The role solidified during a Thanksgiving dinner when I was 28. Daniel had just left another job. Tension hovered around him like static. My parents were anxious, careful with their tone. The conversation revolved around his next steps. At one point, my mother turned to me and said lightly, "Scarlett, you're the stable one. Talk some sense into your brother." Everyone laughed. I did too. But something inside me paused. Stable one. It wasn't said as a compliment. It was said as an assignment. My stability wasn't just appreciated, it was required. I was expected to regulate not only myself, but the emotional temperature of the room. Later that night, washing dishes alone, I replayed the moment, not angrily, just analytically. If I ever faltered, who would stabilize me? The uncomfortable answer surfaced quietly. No one, because I had trained them not to see that as necessary. The role of the reliable daughter came with privileges: trust, autonomy, minimal interference. But it also came with conditions. Don't disrupt, don't demand, don't destabilize the narrative. Over time, I realized something deeper. My parents didn't see me as fragile because I never allowed fragility to be visible. They didn't minimize my feelings out of cruelty. They minimized them because I delivered them pre-minimized. I had been participating in my own invisibility. That realization wasn't dramatic. It didn't spark rebellion. It sparked awareness. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If I stopped performing stability, would anyone know who I actually was? And more importantly, would they want to? The shift didn't happen during a fight. It didn't happen during a holiday. It didn't happen because someone finally crossed a dramatic line. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was 31, sitting at my dining table, laptop open, half listening to a quarterly review meeting. My phone buzzed. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail, something I rarely did. She texted immediately after, "Call me when you can. It's about your brother." Of course it was. After the meeting ended, I called her back. Daniel had made another impulsive decision, this time involving a business partnership that had dissolved unexpectedly. There were financial consequences, emotional consequences, disappointment. She spoke quickly, anxiously. I could hear my father in the background, pacing. Then she said it. I don't know what we'd do without you, Scarlett. You're the only calm one. Can you talk to him? Maybe help him think through the next steps? You're just better at these things. Better at these things. I stared at the wall while she spoke. There was no malice in her voice, only reliance. But something inside me felt tired in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not irritated, not angry, just exhausted. After I hung up, I didn't immediately call Daniel. I didn't open spreadsheets. I didn't draft contingency plans in my head. I just sat there. And for the first time, I asked myself a question without rushing to silence it. When do I get to not be the calm one? The question felt almost rebellious. I walked to the bookshelf in my living room and pulled out my old leather journal, the one I had kept since I was 16. I hadn't written in it for years. I flipped through old entries, pages filled with carefully edited feelings, polished reflections, rational explanations for why something wasn't a big deal. Even in private, I had been measured. There were entries about that writing program I declined, about feeling overshadowed, about wanting to be celebrated just once without pre-softening it. Reading them at 31, I felt something I hadn't expected. Grief, not for lost opportunities. For the younger version of me who kept negotiating herself down to stay lovable. I sat on the floor for a long time that afternoon, and something shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. I realized I had mistaken emotional containment for strength. I had believed that absorbing impact quietly was maturity, but absorbing without acknowledgement leaves residue. And I was carrying residue from years of being the one who understood. That was the day I stopped seeing my silence as virtue, not because it was wrong, but because it was automatic. Silence can be generous. Silence can be wise, but silence can also be avoidance of discomfort, of confrontation, of the possibility that the people you love may not respond the way you hope. That afternoon, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send a dramatic message. I didn't withdraw. I simply didn't immediately fix it. I let Daniel handle his own fallout. I let my parents sit with their anxiety, and I sat with my own. It was uncomfortable. My instinct was to intervene, to stabilize, to perform. But I didn't. For the first time in my life, my silence wasn't compliance. It was a choice. And that distinction changed everything. After that Tuesday, nothing exploded. No one accused me of changing. No one confronted me. But I knew something was different. For the first time in my life, I began observing my own reactions before offering them. When my mother called the following week to update me on Daniel's situation, I listened, but I didn't immediately volunteer solutions. She paused at one point and said, "What do you think he should do?" I answered carefully, "I think he's capable of figuring it out." There was a silence on the other end. Not dramatic, just unfamiliar. "Well, yes," she replied slowly. "Of course." That was it. A small sentence, almost invisible. But it was the first time I had declined the stabilizer role without explanation, and no one collapsed. Over the next few months, I practiced something that felt radical in its simplicity. I stopped pre-solving. When family group messages spiraled into logistical confusion about holidays, I waited before stepping in. When Daniel vented about another frustration, I listened without reorganizing his future. When my parents made subtle comments like, You always have everything together. I stopped replying with a reassuring smile. I simply said, "It doesn't always feel that way." They didn't know what to do with that sentence. Not because it was confrontational, it wasn't, but it introduced complexity into a role that had always been simple. At first, they interpreted my restraint as busyness. "You've been quiet lately," my mother observed one evening. "Just focused," I replied. And I was, but not only at work. I began focusing on my internal responses. I noticed how often I edited myself before speaking, how often I softened achievements, how often I swallowed irritation to preserve comfort. Silence, I realized, had always been my reflex. Now it was becoming deliberate. There's power in deliberate quiet. When you stop reacting automatically, people begin revealing what they expect from you. And what they reveal can be uncomfortable. One Sunday dinner at my parents' house, Daniel was animatedly discussing a potential new venture. It sounded risky, poorly planned. My father looked at me instinctively. "Well, Scarlett," he prompted, "you're the numbers person." I took a sip of water. "I don't have enough information to weigh in." Daniel frowned. "Come on, you always have an opinion." I met his eyes calmly, not always. The room shifted slightly. Not tense, just recalibrating. Later, my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. "You seem distant." There it was. When I stopped performing usefulness, it registered as withdrawal. I considered giving her reassurance, telling her I was just tired, that nothing was wrong. Instead, I said, "I'm just trying not to insert myself into things that aren't mine to carry." She blinked, processing. "I never asked you to carry anything," she replied. I believed she meant that, but intent and impact aren't the same. That night, driving home, I felt a surprising steadiness. For years, my silence had protected others from discomfort. Now my silence was protecting me from overextension. They mistook it for detachment, but it wasn't detachment. It was a boundary. And boundaries, when you've never had them, feel unnatural at first, not only to others, but to you. I wasn't angry. I wasn't preparing a speech. I was simply gathering clarity, because before I could confront my parents about the pain I endured in the past, I needed to understand it fully myself. And that understanding was beginning to take shape, quietly, strategically, without announcement. When people think of preparation, they imagine dramatic moves, lawyers, ultimatums, late-night arguments. My preparation looked nothing like that. It looked like therapy appointments were scheduled during lunch breaks. It looked like rereading old journal entries without editing them. It looked like sitting in my car after family dinners and voice memo recording exactly how I felt before I had time to rationalize it away. For most of my life, I had processed emotions through logic. If something hurt, I explained it. If something felt unfair, I reframed it. If something stung, I minimized it. Now, I began documenting without defending anyone. Not to build a case against my parents, but to build clarity for myself. I wrote down patterns. When I shared good news, what was the response? When Daniel shared uncertainty, how did the energy in the room change? When I expressed vulnerability, what happened next? The answers weren't explosive, they were consistent. My achievements were acknowledged, then quickly normalized. My struggles were reframed as temporary because I was strong. My brother's missteps were analyzed with depth and patience. Again, none of it was malicious, but repetition creates architecture. And the architecture of my family placed me in a load-bearing role. Therapy gave me language I hadn't previously allowed myself to use. Parentification. emotional minimization, conditional praise. I resisted those words at first. They felt accusatory. My therapist would gently ask, "If a friend described this dynamic to you, what would you call it?" That question dismantled my defenses more effectively than any confrontation could have. I wasn't abused. I wasn't neglected, but I was relied upon in ways that exceeded my age. I was emotionally organized for the benefit of others. And when that becomes identity, it's difficult to separate who you are from what you provide. Outside my family, I started experimenting with honesty. When a colleague praised my work, I didn't deflect. I said, "Thank you, I worked hard on that." The first time I said it, my heart raced like I had confessed something dangerous. Nothing bad happened. When a friend asked how I was doing, instead of, "I'm fine," I said, "Actually, I've been thinking a lot about my family dynamics." The world didn't collapse. In fact, conversations deepened. Meanwhile, at home, my reduced intervention continued. Daniel eventually stabilized on his own, imperfectly, but independently. My parents adapted to solving more of their own emotional turbulence. They never acknowledged the shift directly, but I noticed something subtle. When I stopped filling every silence, others started speaking differently. There were longer pauses at dinner, more direct conversations between my parents and Daniel, less triangulation through me. It was as if by stepping slightly out of frame, I allowed the real dynamic to reveal itself. And what I saw clearly for the first time was this: I had been protecting them from the discomfort of seeing me. As long as I was competent, calm, and contained, they didn't have to examine whether I had been overlooked. But if I spoke, truly spoke, it would require them to confront not only my pain, but their participation in it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful, because I understood something important. Confrontation is not about unloading emotion. It's about timing, clarity, and intention. So I kept documenting, not events, patterns, not accusations, impact. I was preparing for a conversation that wouldn't be loud. It would be precise. And precision requires patience. They never noticed the preparation. They only saw that I had become quieter. What they didn't understand was that my quiet was no longer compliance. It was calibration, and soon I would use it. The clarity didn't arrive in a dramatic breakthrough. It arrived in a sentence. I was sitting across from my therapist one Thursday afternoon, describing a recent dinner at my parents' house. Daniel had been venting about work again. My father had looked at me instinctively when things got tense. My mother had said, half jokingly, "Scarlet will keep us grounded." I had smiled. I had redirected the conversation, same as always. After I finished recounting it, my therapist tilted her head slightly and asked, "What would have happened if you hadn't stepped in?" I paused. "I don't know," I said. "Would someone have been harmed?" "No." "Would the family have collapsed?" "No." "Would they have felt uncomfortable?" I exhaled. "Probably." She nodded. "So, whose discomfort were you managing?" The answer landed slowly. "Not mine." That was the private reveal. For years, I had believed I was maintaining peace. But peace and comfort are not the same thing. Peace is stable. Comfort is fragile. And I had been managing comfort. I had been buffering my parents from the discomfort of seeing Daniel struggle without rescue. Buffering Daniel from the discomfort of accountability. Buffering everyone from the discomfort of imbalance. And in doing so, I had absorbed the discomfort myself. That realization changed the emotional equation. Because once you see that you are carrying something unnecessary, you can't unsee it. A few weeks later, I revisited my old journals again. This time, I wasn't looking for proof. I was looking for pattern continuity. Entry after entry contained variations of the same theme. I don't want to make this a big deal. I'm probably overreacting. It's fine. I'll handle it. I wasn't fine. I was efficient. There's a difference. The leverage I discovered wasn't financial. It wasn't legal. It wasn't some secret that could be weaponized. It was narrative leverage. For the first time, I understood the full story of my role and how I had participated in maintaining it. That meant I could change it, not by exposing anyone, but by telling the truth calmly. And truth, delivered without heat, is difficult to dismiss. The more I sat with this understanding, the less reactive I felt. I didn't want to accuse my parents. I didn't want apologies extracted under pressure. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted to say clearly, I carried more than you realized. And I did it because I thought that was what love required. The power of that sentence wasn't in its volume. It was in its steadiness. The private reveal also came with another realization. They might not respond the way I hoped. They might deny. They might minimize. They might feel defensive. And I would have to be prepared for that. So I rehearsed internally, not arguments, but boundaries. If they said, "We did our best," I would say, "I know." And this still impacted me. If they said, "You never told us," I would say, "I didn't feel safe to." If they said, "You're misremembering," I would say, "This is how it felt to me." No escalation, no character attacks, no historical relitigation, just impact. That was the leverage, because impact is personal truth. And personal truth doesn't require consensus to be valid. By the time I decided I would speak, I no longer felt like a wounded child seeking validation. I felt like an adult clarifying history, and there's a quiet dominance in that position. Not power over someone, power over your own narrative. The reveal wasn't shared yet, but it had solidified inside me. And once something solidifies, action becomes inevitable. Once clarity settled, I faced something harder than anger: choice. For years, the narrative had been automatic. I reacted. I adjusted. I absorbed. There was no decision required because the role was already written. Now I had options. Option 1, say nothing. Maintain the improved boundaries quietly. Let the past remain unspoken. Continue evolving privately. Option 2, address it partially. Make small comments when something stings. Correct dynamics in real time, but never revisit history. Option 3, have the full conversation. Name the pattern. Acknowledge the pain. Risk destabilizes the family's understanding of itself. Each option had consequences. If I stayed silent, I would preserve comfort. My parents would continue believing they had raised one low-maintenance child and one high-maintenance one. The family mythology would remain intact, but I would know the truth. And knowing something without speaking it creates distance. If I addressed it incrementally, I might avoid a dramatic rupture. But fragments of truth tend to scatter. They don't always form a coherent picture. The third option was irreversible. Once you say, "I confronted my parents about the pain I endured in the past," you cannot return to being the easy daughter. You cannot unintroduce complexity. I spent weeks thinking about timing. Was this selfish? Was it necessary? Was it fair to revisit old dynamics when everyone had technically moved on? The question that clarified everything wasn't about fairness. It was about authenticity. Could I continue building a life rooted in honesty while avoiding the most formative dynamic of my life? The answer was no. not because my parents were villains, but because I was no longer willing to participate in a story that erased parts of me. The decision didn't come in a burst of courage. It came in a quiet moment on a walk through my neighborhood. The air was cold. My breath is visible. I remember watching a woman teach her toddler how to balance on a curb. She held the child's hands but didn't lift him. She let him wobble, and something about that image settled into me. My parents had always believed they were supporting me by assuming I was strong. But strength without acknowledgement becomes isolation. I didn't want to accuse them of failing. I wanted them to understand what their assumptions had cost. That distinction mattered. So I chose the irreversible option, not to hurt them, not to shock them, not to win, but to integrate myself fully into my own history. I texted my parents and asked if we could have dinner, just the three of us. No, Daniel. My mother replied almost immediately, "Of course. Is everything okay?" I stared at the message. For a moment, the old instinct returned. Reassure her. Make it small. Say it's nothing serious. Instead, I typed, "Yes, I just want to talk about something important." The three dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Then, okay. That was the moment it became real. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no rehearsed accusations. But I had crossed an internal threshold. I had chosen not to carry it alone anymore. And that choice, more than anything else, marked the end of who I used to be. Once the dinner was scheduled, I didn't spiral. That surprised me. I expected anxiety, rehearsed arguments, sleepless nights. Instead, I moved with unusual calm because this wasn't a reaction. It was a decision already made. In the weeks leading up to that dinner, I didn't hint at anything. I didn't withdraw. I didn't overcompensate. I interacted with my parents the same way I always had. Polite, steady, measured. But internally, I was organizing, not evidence. Structure. I wrote down 3 things I needed the conversation to include. Specific patterns, not vague accusations. The emotional impact, not character judgments. A clear boundary about who I would be moving forward. I practiced saying sentences out loud while driving, not dramatic speeches, just clarity. When my achievements were treated as expected, I felt unseen. When I was labeled the strong one, I stopped expressing struggle. I participated in that pattern too. I'm not blaming you. I'm explaining my experience. I knew something important. If I entered the conversation seeking validation, I would lose balance. Validation is dependent on the response. Clarity is not. So I anchored myself in clarity. At the same time, I adjusted small present-day behaviors. When my mother texted asking for advice about Daniel's new idea, I replied, "I trust you both to navigate that together." When my father made a passing comment like, "You've always had it easier emotionally," I didn't correct him immediately. I simply noted it, not as ammunition, as confirmation. The shift in me was subtle but firm. I wasn't gathering leverage over them. I was consolidating alignment within myself. That alignment made something else possible: neutrality. The old version of me would have entered this conversation apologetic for even bringing it up. The reactive version might have entered defensively, but this version, the one who had documented patterns and examined her own participation, felt steady. The days moved normally. Work deadlines, grocery shopping, Sunday phone calls. Nothing in their world signaled that something irreversible was approaching, and I didn't want it to. Quiet dominance isn't about surprising people. It's about arriving fully prepared when the moment comes. The night before the dinner, I opened my old leather journal one more time. Instead of rereading past entries, I wrote a new one. Tomorrow I speak without shrinking. That was it. No anger, no blame, just intention. The next evening, I drove to my parents' house. The porch light was on, the same one that had welcomed me home since childhood. As I parked, I noticed something almost surreal. Everything looked the same trimmed hedges, the same wind chime by the door, the same faint scent of detergent when I stepped inside. The environment hadn't changed, but I had, and that difference was about to be introduced into a system that had never accounted for it. They hugged me at the door. My mother asked about work. My father poured wine. Normal, comfortable, predictable. They had no idea that the stable daughter they trusted to keep things smooth had decided to say something that would permanently alter the emotional landscape. Not loudly, not cruelly, but undeniably. And once spoken, it would not be taken back. The dinner itself didn't start with confrontation. We talked about traffic, about a neighbor who had repainted their house an unfortunate shade of blue, about Daniel's latest update. Carefully, cautiously, I waited until the plates were cleared, until the rhythm of the evening had softened. Then I said calmly, "There's something I've been thinking about for a while, and I'd like to share it." Both of them looked at me, not alarmed, but attentive. I noticed how unfamiliar that felt. "I've realized," I continued, "that growing up, I carried more emotionally than I understood at the time." My mother's forehead creased slightly. My father leaned back in his chair. "I was always the stable one," I said. "The easy one, the strong one." They nodded faintly. Agreement. Recognition. But being seen that way meant I stopped showing you when I wasn't okay. Silence. Not defensive yet. Just still. "I don't think you intended that," I added. And I participated in it. I minimized things. I handled things alone. But over time, it made me feel unseen. My father spoke first. "Unseen? Scarlett, we've always been proud of you." "I know," I said gently, "and I'm not questioning your pride. I'm explaining the impact." My mother's voice was softer. "Why didn't you tell us you felt this way?" There it was, the question I had rehearsed for. "I didn't feel like there was room," I replied. Whenever I tried to express something difficult, it was reframed as me being strong, or sensitive, or practical. Eventually, I stopped trying. The air shifted, not explosive, not hostile, but heavier. My father crossed his arms, a familiar posture when processing discomfort. "That was never our intention," he said carefully. "I believe you," I answered, "but intention and impact can be different." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I spoke in patterns. When Daniel struggled, the family energy mobilized around him. When I succeeded, it was expected. When I struggled, it was minimized. That shaped me. My mother blinked back something. Not tears exactly, but recognition. "We thought you were okay," she whispered. "I wasn't always," I said. "I just became very good at appearing that way." The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. There were moments of defensiveness. "We treated you equally. We never favored anyone. You were independent." Each time I stayed with impact. "I'm not asking you to agree with every detail. I'm asking you to understand that this was my experience." Something changed in the second hour. The energy shifted from correction to listening, not fully, not perfectly, but enough. When I finally stood to leave, the house felt quieter than usual, not tense, reflective. Over the next few days, subtle consequences began. My mother called, but her tone was different. Less automatic reassurance, more careful listening. My father texted me an article about emotional roles in families. No commentary, just the link. Daniel reached out, seemingly unaware of the full conversation, but more direct in asking for support rather than assuming it. No one exploded, no one cut ties. But something intangible had cracked open. The mythology of the easy daughter had been disturbed. And disturbance, even gentle, has ripple effects. For the first time, my parents were sitting with a version of their history that included the impact they hadn't accounted for. And I was sitting with something new too. Relief, not because they fully understood yet, but because I had finally spoken. I had confronted my parents about the pain I endured in the past, and the world had not ended. It had simply shifted. In the weeks after the conversation, there wasn't chaos. There was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one I had lived in for years. This quiet was reflective. My mother called more frequently, but instead of launching into updates, she asked questions that felt tentative. How have you really been lately? Not the automatic version, the careful one. My father, who rarely discussed emotions directly, began referencing small moments from my childhood. I didn't realize you turned down that writing program because of what we said, he admitted during one call. I thought you lost interest. There was something fragile in his voice. Regret, maybe, but regret doesn't rewrite memory. That was the part we all had to sit with. You can acknowledge impact. You can feel remorse, but you can't retroactively show up differently. That's what made it heavy. One Sunday afternoon, I visited again. Daniel wasn't there. My parents seemed slightly off balance. Not distant, but unsettled in a way I hadn't seen before. At one point, my mother said quietly, I keep replaying things in my head, wondering what we missed. I paused. You didn't miss it, I said gently. I hid it. She shook her head. But you were a child. That sentence lingered. For the first time, the narrative was shifting from, you never told us, to, we should have noticed. Not as accusation, as realization. My father joined us at the table. I always thought treating you like you were strong was respect, he said. I didn't realize it might feel like distance. I met his eyes. It felt like expectation, I answered. There was no yelling, no defensiveness left in the room, just an uncomfortable awareness that something formative had been misunderstood. And that misunderstanding had shaped all of us. The hardest moment came when my mother said, almost to herself, I wish we could go back. I understood the instinct to fix it, to redo certain conversations, to celebrate differently, to pause longer. But adulthood doesn't offer rewrites. It's not about going back, I said softly. It's about seeing it clearly now. There was grief in that clarity, not dramatic grief, but the quiet kind, the kind that settles into your chest and changes the way you hold memories. They began apologizing more directly, not sweeping apologies, specific ones. I'm sorry we made you feel like you couldn't struggle. I'm sorry we didn't ask deeper questions. And I accepted them, not because they erased anything, but because they acknowledged something real. Still, there was an undercurrent neither of us could ignore. The younger version of me had navigated alone. No apology could accompany her retroactively. That part was done. Too late to fix, but not too late to understand. And understanding, even delayed, creates a different future. The consequences weren't explosive. They were transformative. My parents were now grappling with the realization that the daughter they believed had been effortlessly fine, had, in fact, been carefully self-managed. And I was grappling with something equally complex, letting go of the identity of the silent, strong one. Because once they saw me differently, I could no longer hide behind that role. The old structure was dissolving, not destroyed, reconfigured. And with that reconfiguration came the final step, a confrontation without heat, not to accuse, but to close the loop completely. A month after that first dinner, I asked them to sit down with me again, not because something new had happened, but because clarity deserved completion. We sat in the living room this time. Afternoon light through the windows. No wine. No distractions. I want to say something clearly, I began. Not emotionally, just directly. They both nodded. I finally spoke up about the wounds I had carried for years. The sentence hung in the air. Not dramatic, just undeniable. I don't need you to relive every moment, I continued. And I'm not asking for ongoing apologies. What I need is acknowledgement that my experience was real, even if it wasn't your intention. My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees. It was real, he said quietly. No qualifiers, no corrections, just that. My mother's eyes were glassy, but she didn't cry. We thought calling you strong was empowering, she said. We didn't realize it was isolating. It was both, I replied. I am strong, but I also needed room to not be. There was something almost steady about the conversation. No raised voices, no dramatic pauses. Just three adults re-examining history with more emotional vocabulary than we had ever used before. I don't want our relationship to be defined by this, my father said. It won't be, I answered, but it will include it. That distinction mattered. Inclusion, not domination. I wasn't rewriting my childhood as tragic. I was integrating complexity. I also want you to know, I added, I participated in the pattern. I minimized myself because it felt easier. I don't blame you entirely, but I can't continue that way. My mother reached for my hand. We don't want you to. That sentence felt different from reassurance. It felt like permission. For the first time, I wasn't managing their reaction. I wasn't scanning the room for tension. I wasn't softening my words mid-sentence. I was present, calm, grounded. There was no explosion because I hadn't brought fire. I had brought clarity, and clarity doesn't demand volume. Before I left, my father said something I hadn't expected. I'm glad you confronted us. The word sounded foreign in his mouth. Confronted, not attacked, not accused. Confronted. Yes, I said softly. So am I. Driving home, I noticed something subtle. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt integrated. The child who had swallowed discomfort and the adult who spoke calmly now existed in the same body without contradiction. The confrontation hadn't destroyed the family. It had matured it. And I realized something important. Quiet dominance isn't about controlling others. It's about refusing to abandon yourself. That afternoon, I hadn't demanded change. I had modeled it, and that model would quietly reshape everything moving forward. I'm still Scarlett. I still live in the same townhouse in Portland. I still work in compliance. I still prefer listening before speaking. On the surface, not much has changed, but internally, everything has recalibrated. I am no longer the easy daughter. I am the honest one. The difference is subtle but profound. When my mother calls now, she asks different questions, not out of obligation, out of awareness. How are you really? And I answer differently. Sometimes the answer is still, I'm good. But sometimes it's, I've been overwhelmed, or I'm proud of something I did, or even, I felt hurt by that comment earlier. And the world doesn't collapse. My father has become quieter in conversations, in a thoughtful way. He pauses before labeling me as strong. Sometimes he says, I don't want to assume. How does that feel for you? That sentence alone tells me something shifted. Daniel and I have changed too. Without me reflexively stabilizing him, he has developed more self-accountability. Our conversations are less about problem solving and more about mutual adulthood. I no longer manage him, I relate to him. The most important shift, though, isn't in them. It's in me. I don't pre-soften my accomplishments anymore. When I received a major promotion last year, I told my parents directly, I worked incredibly hard for this. I'm proud of myself. There was a pause, not from dismissal, but from recalibration. Then my mother smiled and said, You should be. And for once, the pride lingered in the room longer than a passing acknowledgement. I've also allowed myself visible vulnerability. The first time I cried in front of them as an adult, not dramatically, just honestly, I felt exposed, but I didn't rush to apologize for it. I let it exist. That was new. There's no bitterness in me, no desire to reassign blame. My parents did the best they could with the emotional tools they had, but I am responsible for upgrading mine. Who I am now is someone who understands that silence is powerful, but only when it's chosen, not conditioned. I still value calm. I still dislike unnecessary drama, but I no longer confuse harmony with health. If something matters, I say it. If something hurts, I name it. If something excites me, I let it expand. I don't shrink to preserve comfort. And interestingly, the family feels more stable now than it ever did when I was silently absorbing tension. Because stability built on honesty is stronger than stability built on suppression. The younger version of me believed that love required endurance. The current version understands that love requires visibility. I am still strong, but I am also allowed to be complex. And that complexity doesn't threaten the people who truly care. It deepens the relationship. For years, I thought confronting my parents would fracture something. Instead, it clarified something. And clarity is quieter than people expect, but far more lasting. If you've stayed with me this long, you might have expected a dramatic ending, a moment of tears, a powerful apology, a cinematic reconciliation. But real emotional shifts rarely look like that. They look like quieter dinners, more thoughtful questions, longer pauses before assumptions. They look like integration. I confronted my parents about the pain I endured in the past, not to accuse them, not to rewrite history, not to demand repayment for emotional labor. I did it because I no longer wanted to live divided, strong on the outside, silent on the inside. And here's what I learned. You can love your parents and still acknowledge their blind spots. You can be grateful and still be hurt. You can be strong and still have needed more. Those truths can exist at the same time. The most powerful part of this story isn't that my parents apologized. It's that I stopped abandoning myself. For years, I thought being the good daughter meant absorbing discomfort quietly. I thought maturity meant not making things complicated. But maturity, I've realized, is the ability to hold complexity without aggression. To say, this impacted me. I participated in it too. And I want something healthier moving forward. There was no revenge, no humiliation, no emotional explosion, just clarity. And clarity, delivered calmly, reshapes relationships more effectively than anger ever could. If you're the stable one in your family, if you've been labeled strong, independent, low maintenance, if you've ever wondered whether your quiet wounds are big enough to speak about, maybe the question isn't whether they're big. Maybe the question is whether they're yours. You don't need a dramatic backstory to deserve acknowledgement. You just need honesty. So I'll leave you with this. If you finally spoke up about something you've carried for years, not to hurt, but to heal, What would you say? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.